How do you measure the size of an entire economy? I buy a coffee here in London for £3. The £3 is taken into account for the GDP of the United Kingdom. And so is this barista's salary. And this espresso machine. In fact, most of what's around you is part of GDP. GDP is an important gauge of the overall health of an economy. It stands for Gross Domestic Product. Simply put, the total value of all goods and services in a country is measured by GDP. That means it measures a lot of stuff worth a lot of money. In the UK, GDP is around $3.12 trillion per year. In the United States, the world's biggest economy, it's around $22.67 trillion in this year. How do you get to these numbers? Well, you can calculate GDP in a few different ways, but the most commonly used equation goes like this: consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports equals GDP. Let's break that down. Consumption is another way of saying consumer spending. It's the money you or I spend on physical goods, like coffee, and on services, like a haircut. In many developed economies like the UK or the US, consumer spending makes up more than half of a country's GDP. The second part of the GDP equation is investment. This measures how much businesses spend on things like buildings, land, and equipment. It also includes a major consumer investment, buying a home. When the economy is collapsing, investment can suffer. That's because companies were simply trying to save money instead of putting it toward things like factories, machinery, and equipment. Okay, now we get to government spending. This is the money local, state, and national governments spend on things like roads, schools, and defense. Government spending varies a lot depending on each country's approach to public goods and services. Take for example France, where government spending amounts to roughly 55.5% of GDP. That's compared to 35.4% in the UK and roughly 35% in the US. That brings us to the final part of the GDP calculation: net exports, or exports minus imports. A lot of countries have negative net exports, meaning they bring in more products than they send out. For example, the UK imports around $1 billion worth of coffee every year but only exports around $350 million, meaning its net exports of coffee are negative. Countries around the world collect data on consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. This makes GDP a universal measurement and a way for countries to stack up against one another, but it's not just a sum of the equation people look at. You'll often hear about the GDP growth rate, or the percentage change in GDP over time. Generally, if an economy is healthy, GDP growth expands. If an economy is in bad shape, GDP growth contracts. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth are referred to as a recession. But GDP doesn't always give a full picture of the economy. Critics say the equation puts too much weight on production and manufacturing, and not enough on services and the digital economy. Just think of Netflix. For $12.99 a month you can watch unlimited movies. In the past, you would have had to buy all of those movie DVDs separately, with each one contributing to GDP. It's hard to factor a digital service like Netflix into the GDP equation, which is used to measure physical goods. GDP also doesn't measure economic equality and well-being. So even if a country is really rich according to GDP, wealth may be spread unevenly. Plus, GDP excludes unpaid work like volunteering for charity or childcare. And it doesn't factor in costs like pollution or illegal activity. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching our video. Be sure to check out more of your ALESAF explains over here. And leave us any other doubt in the comments section. See you soon.